Hi everyone, thanks for stopping by and for returning to the old world. Today, let's talk about the mental load in wargaming. Firstly, what do I mean by mental load? Well, really what I'm talking about here is the complexities of a game which players need to learn either to play their own game, their own army effectively, or to avoid traps and gotcha moments by learning what other factions can do with specific special rule combinations in particular circumstances. On top of that, I'm also really talking about games with lots and lots of complicated rules, lots of charts to refer to, or the requirement to make lots of notes and to keep lots of paperwork during the course of a game. Lots of stuff to remember, basically, and keep track of. Now, within this context, fully appreciate that trends in wargaming generally have changed over the years. I'm not just talking about Games Workshop here, but wargaming in its wider sense. So I know historical wargaming, predating really the time Games Workshop had the huge market share and such like, went through a real phase of looking for realism. And what that meant was lots of complicated rules, lots of dice roll modifiers, lots of tables and charts to refer to, and endless amounts of paperwork. I do remember many years ago playing some Napoleonic games with my dad. It was relatively small scale stuff, so a block of models had lots of figures glued to it, and each represented a specific number of men. Now, as the game went on, you had to keep track of how many men each unit had lost, because once you hit a certain number, that would be a block gone, and that in turn affected the formations the unit could form. So a battalion would have 4 or 5 blocks of men, which would be roughly equivalent to about 200 people it represents. So when you lost 200 men, that meant you took a block of figures off, and that then had an impact on what that unit could do. As an aside, working out how many people had been killed by a particular attack was itself quite complicated, with lots of factors to take into account: the quality of the troops, the weather, the range, whether they'd fired their weapons before, and various other things as well. It all got quite complicated and a bit of a mathematical exercise to work out what was going on. Needless to say, these games, they weren't quick. Since then, there have been a number of other trends in game development. We've seen simpler games develop. We've seen the use of cards. We've seen the use of command points, both to trigger stratagems, but also as a command and control measure. And we've also seen games introducing lots of very specific special rules for individual armies within a game. There's been all sorts of trends over the years. So not all of them really are Games Workshop related, because you have to think of it in the trend of general game design, and obviously no game sits in a complete vacuum. So let's look at a couple of specific examples of the mental load in action. Firstly, I'm going to have a look at Warhammer 40,000, specifically 9th edition. So across the various armies that can take to the field, you've got your core rules, you've got your army special rules, you've got your warlord traits, both from the core rules and the army specific ones, you've got relics, you've got stratagems, and you've got just general rules bloat. There are a lot of things to keep track of, and how different rules can apply and different strategies can apply in different specific circumstances that can occur during the game. This does lead to a lot of gotchas, where a player can walk into a trap they didn't know was being set for them because they just weren't aware or had forgotten, or some specific rules or opportunities existed. And that's before just thinking about the vast number of things a player needs to learn in order to use their own army to the maximum efficiency, which is fine if you want to put in the time and effort to learn all of this sort of stuff. But if you're playing a bit more casually, then it becomes a bit of a challenge. It does remind me a little bit, I have to say, of my attempts to play War Machine and, well, I suppose Warhammer Hordes, really, as it's War Machine and Hordes are very similar sets. Now, that game did seem to be largely all about putting together combinations of special rules in certain circumstances in order to get one over your opponent and to really trigger those gotcha moments. And as a casual player just getting into the game, I found it really difficult to maintain my interest when I've never really could get to grips with why I'd lost a particular game or a certain thing had happened. I knew that it was because of a certain combination of rules provided by certain units doing things, possibly in tandem. But when it was so specific to a particular circumstance with certain units from a certain faction, it did mean that it's unlikely in your next game you'd have a similar occurrence. So you couldn't learn from one game, take that lesson into the next one, because you'd be facing a completely different selection of special rules and armies that operated in a very different way. So I did very quickly fall out of love with the idea of War Machine and Hordes as a game for me. Appreciate other people will like that style of play. They like the competitive and cutthroat nature of it. And to be fair, it did say in the rules right at the start that it's designed for that sort of competitive play. So, fair enough, really. If that's the kind of game you like to play, it just wasn't one for me. But I digress. Before we move on to any other rule system, I would just like to point out, and I think in fairness to the Warhammer 40k community, from what I've seen with my local community, from what I've seen with people sharing their experiences of events and communities in other areas, it does look like the community seems quite good at pointing out potential gotchas. So when a player starts to act in a certain way, to say, do you realise I've got a strategy where I can do X, Y, Z? So a player can then make an informed choice about what they're doing. This is great sportsmanship and really, great play really by the community. And it's great that kind of stuff seems to be fairly prevalent. My other example to talk about with mental load really is X-Wing First Edition. I've not played 2 or 2.5, so I'm not going to comment on that. But when X-Wing First Edition came out, it was, and remained throughout, a really simple game to learn how to play. It was very difficult to master, which is absolutely fine. It wasn't because it was difficult to understand. It was just about getting used to manoeuvring the ships and the kind of things you could do with them. Now, over time, as more and more models got released, each one with cards which could be used across a range of ships to change their loadouts and to give them special effects, different pilots, all this sort of stuff, the game became more and more complicated, and there became more and more combinations of rules that you could apply to a particular ship. And that rules bloat really made it difficult to remember what could do what you might be running into, and made it harder to predict where ships would end up and what effect they would have. Eventually, I think that came to a head to an extent that the game was, my understanding is, anyway, that the game was much simplified as it went into second edition, but by that point I'd moved away from the area I lived at the time, the club I was going to, so I sort of slipped away from wargaming for a little bit while I settled in the new area. And didn't pick up second edition or 2.5 of X-Wing, so I don't really know how the game has gone since then. But, so, X-Wing First Edition, a really nice, clean game that suffered a lot from rules bloat as time went on, which really added to the mental load. So, I've talked about examples of where the mental load exists, but how do you deal with it? Now, I'm not a rules developer. I've mentioned this previously, but A couple of things really I've thought about is strategies. I quite like them. Now, this may seem a bit strange when I've just talked about rules bloat and the complexity of having lots of rules that apply in certain circumstances. I've seen strategies used in a couple of different settings. I've seen them in historical wargaming, sci-fi wargaming as well. I don't think the concept of a strategy that applies in certain circumstances is problematic. Where I think the problem comes is where you have too many of them. I would suggest that there be a cap for the number of strategies available for a faction in a game. If we're putting it in a fantasy setting or a sci-fi setting like Warhammer 40k, I'd be looking at perhaps 9 strategies available to a faction, 3 of which would be strategies that are common to everybody. These would be your things like passing a panic test automatically, or maybe a re-roll, something along those sort of lines. This would leave 6 other strategies. Now, I would think about perhaps making these a little bit harder to use. They're used more rarely, but more expensive in whatever currency you're using to trigger them, command points or whatever. Making them really quite strong, but really flavoursome. So an example from a fantasy setting might be that your Chaos Warriors have the opportunity to fight twice, possibly the second time with a reduction to their weapon skill, to represent the fact that they're just throwing everything they've got into battering their way through the enemy's defences and not placing their shots as much. Another example might be an Empire unit where missile units within 3 inches of a charged unit get to stand and shoot as if they were the target of a charge. So a bit like in an expanded version of the old detachment rules. Things like that just pick up a bit of flavour, maybe give them the Empire the characteristics of units working together a little bit more, and that level of discipline installed in Imperial armies against the wilder, more aggressive forces of chaos. Just by way of example. Well, what else would I do apart from the stratagems? Well, I'd think very carefully about the use of army-specific special rules. And I'd probably try and limit these. Maybe a good use of a standard list of special rules in the core book would be quite helpful. And I'm thinking here to an extent of games like Black Powder and Hail Caesar, where by combining a couple of the core special rules into a faction's forces can really make 2 forces that are on paper very similar play in very different ways. So if you take some medium infantry armed with spears, stat-wise they're pretty much the same, but if you make one of them have the core special rule which makes them more likely to break in combat, and one which, say, if charged, can fight with an extra rank to normal, you suddenly get a different mindset around playing them. You're not going to throw your spearmen, who are more likely to run away, into unfavourable combats, whereas the others are less likely to be aggressive and want to stand their ground a little bit more. You might label those goblins and high elves, I don't know, but suddenly units with very similar stats start to think quite differently. And those rules are all in the core rulebook, and there's only a handful of them. So as long as they are consistently applied, so all goblins get that rule where they're more likely to break, it's not a case of remembering this unit does this unit does that. It's this whole army just does this. And there's like 2-3 such rules just to give them that little bit of flavour. So a little bit to learn, but not too much. And really expanding on that, I think it's impossible to say a game can't have any mental load. In fact, some games, and this varies depending on what you're trying to achieve, but I think some games really need an element of mental load to give you the reward of achieving something and pulling off a good maneuver to get a good result or successfully win the game. oversimplifying can take away from that. And I remember again when Warhammer Fantasy became Age of Sigmar First Edition, I think the rules for Age of Sigmar originally came on pretty much a single sheet of paper, possibly two, and the grittiness of it just seemed even ignoring the silly rules about if your moustache is bigger than your opponent's, certain things happen. It just took away from what the game was and oversimplified. I think it went a little too far. So it's very much about striking that balance. Dare say though, different types of game I think can probably have different levels of mental load. Overall, what I'd like to see really with games is a nice compact rule system that are easy to learn but difficult to master. By difficult to master, I don't mean remember all the tricks. I mean difficult to master as in being able to use those fairly straightforward, easy to understand mechanics in order to get consistently good results. Just really my thoughts on the topic of mental load. Really be interested to know with regards to certainly the current design trends in the wider community, be it Games Workshop games, be it other games. Is there something out there where the mental load's about right? Where the game's complex enough to be interesting, but straightforward enough to have a nice, straightforward game where everyone understands what's going on in a relatively short period of time? Do let me know in the comments. Otherwise, thank you very much for dropping by. This is Return to the Old World. Have a great day.